Thanks, Phil and Matt and Jonathan, for a stimulating conversation on the Socratic method and a good riff that spun off it as well. In your conversation, you covered several other things that Socrates introduced into the field of philosophy. According to Socrates in the Apology, thanks to Plato, his so-called Elenchus was developed to demolish the complacency as a heaven-sent message of those opinionated Athenians who knew various stuff like what is virtue. So right at the very source of the Western intellectual tradition was the Socratic idea of radical skepticism: question everything and make no pretensions to knowledge. I think I might just read to you what Socrates himself said, as Plato reports it at least, on how this mission developed. It arose from the fact that a friend of his had been to the Delphic Oracle and heard that Socrates was the cleverest and the wisest of men, and an idea that Socrates himself couldn't believe. So he says, "When I heard about the oracle's answer, I said to myself, what is the god saying, and what is his hidden meaning? I am only too conscious that I have made no claim to wisdom, great or small. So what can he mean by asserting that I am the wisest of men in the world? He cannot be telling a lie. That would not be right for him." After puzzling about it for some time, I set myself at last, with considerable reluctance, to check the truth of it in the following way. I went to interview a man with a high reputation for wisdom, because I felt that here, if anywhere, I would be able to succeed in disproving the oracle and pointing out to my divine authority, "You said that I was the wisest of men, but here is a man who is wiser than I." Well, I gave a thorough examination to this person. I need not mention his name, but it was one of our politicians that I was studying when I had this experience, and in conversation with him I formed the impression that although in many people's opinion, and especially in his own, he appeared to be wise, in fact he was not. Then when I began to try and show him that he only thought he was wise and was not really so, my efforts were resented both by him and by many of the other people present. However, I reflected as I walked away, well, I am certainly wiser than this man. It is only too likely that neither of us has any knowledge to boast of, but he thinks that he knows something which he does not know, whereas I am quite conscious of my ignorance. At any rate, it seems that I am wiser than he is to this small extent, that I do not think that I know what I do not know. And then he goes on and tells about the other ways he quizzed people, and concludes that this is why I still go about seeking and searching in obedience to the divine command. If I think that anyone is wise, whether citizen or stranger, and when I decide that he is not wise, I try to assist the god by proving that he is not. This occupation has kept me too busy to do much either in politics or in my own affairs. In fact, my service to God has reduced me to extreme poverty. And of course, it also caused pretty much him to fall out of favour with the Athenians, who got him pretty much because he was such a gadfly. Maybe he had been a little bit disingenuous with his protestations of ignorance, but the point is well taken, and it certainly had a strong influence on that sceptical tradition I mentioned. He didn't think that the truth was inherent in the mind either, to be rediscovered or remembered, and it wouldn't be uncovered by the Elenchus. The truth was the domain of the gods, and would never be fully possessed by anybody until death. The true philosopher's task, he thought, was to get rid of the illusions that came via the senses, and that death was the ultimate removal of those sensory confusions. This is what is stated in the Phaedo. This is why his last words was to tell his friend Crito to offer a sacrifice to the god Asclepius, who had healed his soul of the impediment of his body. It was this that made him so enthusiastic about dying, through the disbelieving consternation of his friends. On the topic of suicide, which his friends thought should be a logical consequence of Socrates' belief in the great benefit of death for the soul, Surely one is to pursue the good and the true. Socrates said he didn't know why it was wrong, but supposed it must be something to do with the fact that we belong to the gods, and to take our lives is to steal from the gods. This again is how Plato tells us in the Phaedo. Again, another topic that Socrates dealt with was the idea of violent political action against the state. Socrates' position here, again spelled out, but this time in the Crito, was that the laws are absolutely sacrosanct, and to go against any one of them is to weaken them all. This was never acceptable, and it was these laws that gave us the society that had nurtured us, protected us from our birth, and we owed more gratitude to that even than to our parents. By living in a state, we were the partners of a social contract that meant we would only move against the laws in a legal way by democratically changing them. The only other recourse was to leave the state, as it was illogical and desirable to seek protection from laws you respected on the one hand and attack those that you didn't on the other. And he was true to this position even though he knew that he'd been condemned to death by malicious evidence at his own trial. The fault was not in the legal process, so that had to be respected, and he refused his friend's offer to bust him out of death row. Now a couple of comments about death and oblivion. It's interesting. It seems we humans fear death in a way that other animals don't appear to. So much so that cultures we develop largely revolve around it or its denial. Ernest Becker has written perceptively on the way our cultures and subcultures are programs that offer us a domain to find validity in. The more I count in life and succeed in my culture, the further I seem from being eliminated by death. But we can't banish the fear because we have the ability to imagine ourselves not being, and this gives rise to the flight from death response. It's a consequence of our reflective consciousness, according to Becker. And it's not just the death process. Sure, we fear that because it seldom looks like fun when we see other people die. But more profoundly still, we can imagine our absence from our world, and that seems to chill us at a deeper level. Here, Socrates thought that being dead and obliviated, assuming there was no afterlife, was a rest to be eagerly anticipated, and it was a good alternative if his favoured option, a happy afterlife, hobnobbing with dead philosophers, turned out to be wrong. But I don't think that Socrates really considered this, because he was sure his number one option was true. Actual oblivion is still scary. As Becker wrote in The Denial of Death, I've got a copy of it here, the world of human aspiration is largely fictitious, and if we do not understand this, we understand nothing about man. It is a largely symbolic creation by an ego-controlled animal that permits action in a psychological world, a symbolic behavioral world removed from the boundness of the present moment, from the immediate stimuli which enslave all lower organisms. Man's freedom is a fabricated freedom, and he pays a price for it. He must at all times defend the utter fragility of his delicately constituted fiction, deny its artificiality. Interesting. This is what we do through cultures which provide us a stage in which our lives have meaning, a sort of symbolic but therefore never fully convincing immortality. It's certainly what Socrates was doing about his beliefs about death. And this is the formative assumption underlying all of Socrates' philosophy, a very rosy view of the afterlife. For the 5th century, this was pretty revolutionary. The majority of Greeks then still held to Homer's idea that death was an existence in Hades as a shade where all sensation was dulled apart from an ongoing longing for life as they had had it. This was absorbed into Christian thought too, via St. Paul and the Greek church fathers, not the Judaic tradition. That is that the virtuous are rewarded with an afterlife of full participation in knowing without the dulling nature of the body. Hints of Gnosticism there. I can't help wondering, though, what philosophy Socrates would have developed had he been an atheist, and therefore what Christianity would have developed, and how that would have affected Western philosophy itself. Okay, thanks.